platform and to our panel on finance capital, Marxist perspectives. We have a addition of a new panelist, Radhika Desai, who is a professor of political studies at the University of Manitoba. She wrote Geopolitical Economy Beyond Globalization Empire, forthcoming, Slouching towards Ayodhya, from Congress to Hindutva in Indian politics, and Intellectuals and Socialism, Social Democrats and the Labour Party. She edited Development and Cultural Nationalisms, 2009, and co-edited Volume 27 of Research in Political Economy, co-edited the Future of Capitalism book series. She is joined on the panel by Alan Freeman, co-editor with Radhika Desai of the Future of World Capitalism book series, and Andrew Kliman of a new journal of Critique of Political Economics. He is coordinator of the UK-based Association for Heterodox Economics. He is currently a visiting fellow at the Department of City Planning, University of Manitoba. He has written or edited 4 books and writes articles on economics and politics regularly. Andrew Kliman, a professor of economics at Pace University, is the author of The Failure of Capitalist Production, Underlying Causes of the Great Recession, and Proclaiming Marxist Capital, a refutation of the myth of inconsistency. He and Alan Freeman edit Critique of Political Economy, a new scholarly online journal. Many of his writings are available at akliman.squarespace.com and With Sober Senses, Marxist-Humanist Initiative's publication. Kostas Panagiotis teaches sociology at the New York City College of Technology. He's published on political economy, ecology, and social movements, and has been interviewed by numerous radio and TV programs in the U.S. and abroad. He's the book review editor of the international journal Capitalism, Nature, Socialism. He's also the author of Remaking Scarcity, From Capitalist Inefficiency to Social Democracy. Economic Democracy, thank you. They will all be speaking for 15 and then each one for 10 minutes about the question of what is finance capital, how is it different or the same as ordinary capital, and how do our thoughts about finance capital influence our politics around capital and around its possible overcoming. You may begin.
Thank you. I want to focus on my talk mainly on the claim that the economy is a mess and has increasingly become a mess because profit has been diverted away from productive investment in production, and into financial speculation during the last 30 years. In the United States, the claim's not true, and I'll try to explain that. But first, I want to make a few general comments related to the overall theme of the panel. So let me start here. Okay, so non-financial corporations have increasingly been involved in financial markets over the last 40 years. The share of their assets that are financial assets has increased markedly beginning about 1970.
What's a financial asset for those in the audience?
A security like a bond, stocks, a derivative contract.
But you can buy and sell in the market.
Well, you can buy and sell in the market.
So you can't buy and sell like
Well, let's go.
Yeah. Right. Okay. The distinctions between financial assets, things that have worth, that are claims on value, versus a real asset, which would be like a building for corporations. It's like factory buildings, office buildings, shopping malls, machinery, computer systems, lathes, all of that. This should not take away from my time. Okay. Okay, so this is an important phenomenon, and there are other instances of the increasing role of finance in our lives that are important. But it's also important not to be overwhelmed by new phenomena. Even back in Marx's day, there was a strong pull to focus on surface appearances, and Marx wrote that it's typical of the bourgeois horizon, where business deals fill the whole of people's minds, to see the foundation of the mode of production in the mode of commerce corresponding to it, rather than the other way around. So Marx understood quite well that business deals fill the whole of people's minds, but he nonetheless insisted that the mode of production is the foundation of the mode of commerce, and so forth, not vice versa. And the reason that he insisted on this has to do with his theory of the origin of profit, where profit comes from, and in particular the temporalist character of that theory. He wrote, the proportion in which the profit is divided and the different legal titles by which this division is sanctioned are based on the assumption that profit is already in existence. But the reasons for dividing the profit among two kinds of capitalists turn imperceptibly into the reasons for the existence of the profit. Okay, but profit is produced before its division is undertaken. Okay, so there's a temporal issue having to do with why production is primary here. So despite all appearances, it's primary because production is the source of all profit, interest, dividends, and so forth. And this implies a couple of things. First, that firms engaged in production or commerce or finance, they're all parts of a whole. Okay? But this whole is a whole in which production is decisive. And secondly, despite populist talk of Main Street versus Wall Street, all of the different kinds of capitalist firms have the same class interests, expanding value to the utmost, pumping out as much surplus labor from workers as they can, because that is the source of all of their profits. Okay. One more general comment before I turn to the notion that profit has been diverted from productive investment to financial markets. Some of the hand-wringing and outrage over the use of credit and the importance of finance in our lives seems to stem from, first of all, a romantic dislike of commerce and finance. And some of it seems to stem from dislike of consumer society, so-called, and from the choices that working people make because of their allegedly false consciousness. Some people think like that. I don't. I don't think the role of intellectuals or leftists is to lecture people about how they should spend their money or to recommend that working people live even more austerely than they already do. So I'm not concerned about finance as such. I'm concerned about how we live and our freedom, and I'm much more concerned about a society in which almost all of us have to do what other people tell us to do or we starve. You know, that's where my concerns are. Now, I recently published a book on the underlying causes of the Great Recession, and it's available at a discount. It's right there. And the book emerged as I discovered several facts that contradict the conventional left account of the causes of the Great Recession. So to understand this, the conventional left account tells us that the turning point of recent U.S. economic history was the rise of neoliberalism, or Ronald Reagan, Maggie Thatcher, free market stuff in the early 1980s. And what the neoliberals did was they smashed the working class, causing their share of income and real pay to decline. And the increased exploitation supposedly caused the rate of profit to rebound. And so with all the extra profit, the economy could have grown rapidly if the extra profit had been invested in production. But according to this account, financialization took place. And profit was not plowed back into production, productive investment. It was diverted toward financial speculation. And as a result, we had slow economic growth for a long time, rising debt burdens due to the slow growth, and all of this set the stage for the financial crisis and Great Recession. What I found, generally to my surprise, was, first of all, the turning point of recent economic history. All of the trends that are new date back to the 1970s or before, prior to neoliberalism. It's not a political issue of Republicans coming in, or Ronald Reagan and such. Okay. Secondly, the rate of profit never recovered from the fall it underwent in the late 70s and early 80s, and workers' share of income has been stable during the last 40 years, and their real pay, after inflation pay, has risen during the last 40 years. Okay, and what I want to focus on most now, having to do with financialization, is that the rate of accumulation or productive investment, in factories and equipment and all of that, the rate of accumulation fell not because of a diversion of profit away from investment in production, but because the rate of profit fell. Okay? It's a fall in the rate of profit, not a diversion of profit, that's at issue here. Now, since it's true that the financial assets of U.S. corporations have increased much more rapidly than their productive assets, as I showed right at the start, how can it not be the case that profit has been diverted from productive investment into financial speculation? Okay? This seems preposterous. Okay? Well, first of all, the simple answer is that profit is not the only source of corporations' funds. It's not their only thing that they can spend. They also borrow. Okay? And as we know, leverage, borrowing, has become an increasingly important source of funds. So as we see from this slide, there's been a huge increase in the non-financial corporations' financial assets. This is a log scale, so it's tremendously higher on a regular scale. But what is paid for these financial assets is a comparably huge increase in borrowing, liabilities. Okay? So they're acquiring these financial assets basically by borrowing them.
Can you explain that scale? It doesn't look like a log scale.
It's a natural log scale.
Yeah, but what are the numbers?
They're dollars. Okay, so that's like 2 to the 25 power of dollars. I think that's the way it works. So a lot of that. It's a lot of dollars. Okay. Now, in fact, during the early post-war period, the portion of corporations' financial expenditures, their dividend payments, and their acquisition of financial assets, during the early post-war period, the portion that was using profit to fund these investments was much, or these payments was much higher than in the latter part of the post-war period. Okay? During the period of so-called financialization and neoliberalism, neoliberal regime of accumulation in the last 30 years or so, profit has become less important as a source, and borrowing has become more important as a source of funds for the financial expenditures, the dividends and the buying of stocks and bonds and all of that. Okay, so there are then, roughly speaking, two distinct things going on. Okay, profit goes into the piggy bank, and then it's used for productive investment. Okay, and also dividend payments. Okay, but it doesn't go to purchase the financial assets, basically. And then there's the slot machine, and corporations use borrowed money to fund their gambling. In other words, their purchases of financial assets. It's speculative or something like that. Okay, but also down here, some borrowed money is used for productive investment. And this is important because it has to do with dividends. Dividends have increased markedly as a share of profits in recent years. And when you think about it, you go, well, you can invest or you can pay dividends. You can use the profits for productive investment or you can pay dividends. So the fact that the dividends have been going up as a share leads people to think, productive investment has to be going down as a share. Okay? But you see here, there's almost no relationship at all between the percentage of profit that is productively invested and the percentage that goes to dividends. Okay? And
what is the x-axis in that graph?
The
net production.
The net productive investment as a share of after-tax profit. Net investment, according to the national income accounts, as a percentage of after-tax profit. Okay? And what happens is the fluctuations in productive investment just go along with fluctuations in borrowing. If they want to invest more in production, they borrow more. They don't reduce dividends. And vice versa.
You are saying that years with higher investment are also years which when more dividends have been paid out.
No, I'm saying there's basically no relationship between the percentage of the profit that is productively invested. Okay, so there's basically no relation, and if they just want to increase their productive investment, they don't cut the dividends, they just borrow. Okay?
But the slope is not.
We'll talk about it.
Yeah, but the slope is 0.005.
No, that's an R squared.
No, excuse me, the R squared is 0.005. Okay, excuse me. Okay. So this slide shows that the share of corporations' after-tax profit that went toward productive investment was smaller in the 47 to 1980 period, the light gray, before the rise of neoliberalism in the US, and larger, the dark one, between 1981 and 2001, the first 21 years of neoliberalism. Okay, it's true for all four different measures of profit there. So it just wasn't the case that profit was diverted from productive investment into financial assets. Now, it's true, looking at the white, there was then a sharp fall in the percentage of profit that went toward productive investment between 2002 and 2007. But you can't really attribute that to neoliberalism, the neoliberal regime of accumulation, so-called, or financialization, for the following reason. If they were the causes of that sharp decline, how come the percentage of profit that went into investment did not fall during the previous 21 years? Okay? So, here's what actually took place. Net investment fell very sharply during 2001 and 2002. That's a result of the bursting of the dot-com bubble. Fall in the rate of profit that was very sharp between after 1997 through about 2001, 2002. The recession of 2001, 9/11, and so forth. Okay. Then, however, the rate of growth of net investment in production just skyrocketed for 4 years thereafter, 2004 through 2007. This is not how firms would behave if they were diverting profit away from productive investment and into financial assets. But because of the time lag between the generation of profit and the investment of profit, and because profitability skyrocketed in the middle of the decade, the investment share of profit was extremely low between 2002 and 2006.
About a minute.
Okay. Okay, so finally, this is the most important thing, last but not least. This is the relationship between the thick line, the rate of profit, with a very inclusive measure of profit of US corporations, and the dotted line is the rate of accumulation, or productive investment as a share of the existing capital, since 1970. They move up together, they move down together. Very tight relationship. The R squared is 0.83. And very importantly, movements in the rate of profit occur first, and they're followed by movements in the rate of accumulation. So movements in the rate of profit are causing the movements in the rate of accumulation. And basically, just as a mathematical fact, if profit is not being diverted away from productive investment and into financial instruments, if constant share of profit is being reinvested,
I'm pretty out of time.
yeah, can I just
Sure,
wrap up?
minutes.
Yeah. If profit is not being diverted, if a constant share of profit is plowed back, then the fall in the rate of profit fully explains, as you can see here, the fall in the rate of accumulation. Okay, so just to wrap up then, the rate of profit fell, causing the rate of accumulation to fall. That led to slow economic growth. That led to rising debt burdens, and all of that set the stage for the financial crisis and Great Recession.
I wouldn't really like to speak.
Excuse me. Maybe they
Oh
can
yeah,
find
sure.
some
People
chairs.
who are standing out in the hallway, you can come in and.
Look in an empty room, maybe you can find
Yeah,
some
maybe you can
chairs,
find some
because we
chairs.
have room.
There's a chair there.
There's a chair
One,
there.
but then
One
There's two
chair
chairs.
in here.
Two chairs. Well, we have to steal some for the
Just go all the way around and there'll be some glass doors.
Yeah, go grab some chairs.
because there's lots of room in the room.
Well, how do you guys start?
I'm going to concentrate on the political aspects of what finance capital is doing. Because the economic discussion, first of all, I have very few disagreements with Andrew. When I'm speaking tomorrow at 3 at the Marxist-Humanist discussion on Andrew's book, I'm going to be adding some more technical material, and particularly I'm going to be talking about some of the findings I've made in the economy of the UK in relation to this question, so that one can spread it wider than the US. So I'm going to talk basically, for some reason I don't know why, but the biography that you have just read out seems to have been last year's biography. I don't know, that's not your fault, I'm going to have to check with the brochure. But the most important thing is that I used to work for 10 years for the Mayor of London, and that I no longer work for the Mayor of London. That's because I've retired. I'm living in Canada. And this is bringing me in contact with something I've never really experienced directly before, which is the US political movement. And I'm going to put forward a thesis, and I'm going to make an observation and thesis. The observation is this, that there was no movement in the US that was essentially directed against wealth until the Occupy movement. And to me, that's, I mean, there's a 1930s tradition, the Jack London tradition of opposing the plutocracy, but essentially until the Occupy movement, which I'm going to argue was provoked by finance, there's been no rebirth of a movement in the US that sees wealth and capital as the principal enemy. And that, for me, therefore, is a very significant development. And the problem from a European perspective, and also even from a Canadian perspective, never mind from the rest of the world perspective, that I find with the US left, and I'd like to enter a bit of a dialogue, is that there seems to be a shared consensus from left to right that the main enemy of progress in the USA is the government. I think that's an enormous, successful con-trick that has been played by big capital, and that has diverted the left from, for example, endorsing and supporting and throwing its weight behind campaigns of unionization, throwing its weight behind real measures that really would restrict the power of capital or eliminate the power of capital, throwing its weight behind the kind of thing Costas will be talking about, or David Schweikert at the back has been talking about, which is economic democracy in place of capital, and above all has led it not to focus on the prime problem with capitalism, and this is a discussion that I've been having with the Chinese Marxists around the question of market socialism. The problem is not the market, the problem is capital, and in particular it's private property in capital, and the rights that private property owners are given, which are unlimited. There are no restrictions on what they do. They can do anything. They can dig up tar sands, they can destroy your environment, they can kick you out of your house, they can impose an impossible health system on you, they can buy your government, they can take your newspapers and make them instruments of them, and they have the perfect right to do so, and you have no right to trap them. And if you try and do it and you say that actually there should be a law against it, or the people should have, there should be a public domain which makes that, ecological rape a crime, then somehow you're on the side of big government, somehow you're a socialist, somehow you're part of the problem instead of part of the answer. So I want to sort of signal that I think the Occupy movement, with all its limitations, is a wake-up call in relation to that. The second thesis I want to put forward is that I don't think it's an accident that the Occupy movement came with financialization. Now let me be very clear. There used to be a saying that when America catches cold, the world catches pneumonia. Okay, what happens when America gets cancer? Which is what's happened now. And the cancer is called the finance sector. It's a destructive parasite, and it's metastasizing, and its cells are spreading throughout the world political and economic system. And it's destroying societies, it's destroying cities, it's destroying resources, It could even destroy the planet. So, although I agree that this is a pathological phenomenon, and it's a pathological phenomenon of capitalism, and it's a product of a process that started way back in 1970, when the boom exhausted itself after the war, and the US ability to just control and run and finance the world started to wind down, and then it started to resort increasingly to wilder and wilder policies, financialization, militarization, and all those things. It's a pathological development, but it's a pathological development which creates great danger. And the experience that I have comes from London and in the US, where the whole issue for anybody is that when finance gets out of control, as it does, when the commercial side of banking, which is, as any farmer will tell you, credit is an absolutely necessary thing to be able to run a business and be productive and be part of even a communitarian society. Money is necessary for a while, although we're going to have a very interesting discussion on Sunday at 11 when Costas will be accompanied by Anitra Nelson, who's edited a collection of essays on can we envision a society without money. Nevertheless, for the present, you need money. What you don't need is investment banking. What you don't need is the marketization of everything. And I want to focus on this. The key thing that financialization has meant is not just you pay more interest. It means the interest payments that used to be, for example, when you mortgaged a house, it was locked up in your local credit union, or it was in your regulated local building society, as we call them in Britain. That's now been chopped up, sliced and diced, and sold as an instrument on the world market. Every debt is now for sale. That's a change, and the reason is a whole series of things I don't have time to go into, but I want to talk about the social and political consequences. People get very, very rich. And there's three tricks that the US property markets have managed with you. One is to convince you the problem is the government. The second is to convince you there's no such thing as the working class. It's only a middle class now. I discovered to my amazement after a year in Canada that when people speak about the working class, they mean people who are members of trade unions. They don't speak of the middle class, they mean people who are members of trade unions. Which is, for me, is just like a real culture shock. And the third thing is that the problem is poverty. No, the problem is not poverty. The problem is wealth. That's the problem. And wealth has this enormous distorting effect. I worked in a city which has the richest people in the world, bar except perhaps the USA. And 50%, 48.4% of kids in central London, after you have taken out the costs of housing and residence, live below the poverty line. London is a majority poor city. It's full of deprived people. Why are they deprived? Because the bankers and the financiers and just the get-rich kids have pushed the price of housing up beyond what anybody can afford. And after the houses were taken out of municipal hands by Margaret Thatcher, in the 30 years you can draw true graphs. One shows that basically housing building has dropped in every single year since Margaret Thatcher. The private investors did not come in. There is now a 1,500,000 shortage of housing. Secondly, the price of houses has gone up 6 times in the same period. People do not build houses anymore, they speculate in them. And that's a huge distortion of the housing market, and that produces this cheap buy jowl, wealth and poverty. And it's an international phenomenon. If you look at what happened during the 1980s, the gap between the richest nation in the world and the poorest nation in the world, or just the rich nations and the remaining 2/3, doubled and nearly trebled. And that created, Argentina, that created the Arab Spring, that created the unsustainable governmental systems that you're now reaping the fruit of. That produced the inequality, and I don't know if any of you read this wonderful book by Pickett and Wilson about everywhere you have inequality, everything gets worse. That's what finance is doing. That's what this cancer is doing. So I'm just going to finish. What can one do about it? My line is a lot of people kind of not occupied. You have to understand it, in my opinion, for what it is. It's a canary in the coal mine. It's just saying, wake up. And people should wake up. The problem is the rich, dummy. The problem is private ownership, dummy. The problem is capital, dummy. If people wake up to that, I think the Occupy movement will have achieved something. And I hope the Occupy movement understands that that's going to be the most productive thing it could do, is to get that message over.
Now for Costas.
Yeah, so there is a long history of literature on finance capital that goes back 100 years to Hilferding, and there is much debate in the literature about the difference between finance capital and financial capital, as was used by Marx. And this difference does not mean that the concepts are incompatible. In fact, Hilferding's book in 1910 was hailed by many Marxists as an important addition to Marx's analysis of capitalism, and it was very influential for many Marxist theoreticians afterwards. Lenin, Bukharin, they formed their theory of imperialism. So I just offer this, of course, simply as background. I mean, this will not be an exercise in Marxology. My goal is just to sort of attempt to start. The attempt is to start understanding the present moment, because obviously understanding the present moment is an integral sort of part of trying to change the world and get to a better future. So, but underlying the concept of finance capital was a sense that capitalism was changing. There was a new phase that was a more monopolistic phase compared to the capitalism of the 19th century. And this development, of course, was consistent in many ways with Marx's own discussion of how capitalist competition leads to the concentration and centralization of capital, where basically this competition leads to the consolidation of the control of the markets by fewer and larger capitalist companies. Now, when you think about this, how this relates to our day, well, one of the manifestations of this monopolistic trend is the emergence of the infamous too big to fail banks and corporations. And as the current crisis reminds us, the too big to fail phenomenon creates an interesting dilemma for capital, especially when you're in a period of crisis, and that's the dilemma: do you bail out or do you not bail out? And if you don't bail out, then the fact that the financial system and the industries are dominated by small numbers of giants, the collapse of one or more giants can have very serious repercussions for, the entire economy. And but if you do bail out, there is another problem that is the technical term for that is moral hazard. And basically, what it means is that if you bail out on a regular basis, when banks and industry screw up, and people know, and this creates a precedent, and people recognize that, and this sort of gives them an incentive to engage in the kind of practices that led them to fail in the first instance. So it was partly in the name of avoiding this problem of moral hazard that Lehman Brothers was allowed to fail in the fall of 2008. And of course, when Lehman was allowed to fail, all hell broke loose, and and from then on, the dominant response was not to allow, huge financial corporations to fail, but basically to bail out not just financial corporations, but the auto industry, which is part of the productive sector, and so on. So the U.S. government, as well as government around the world, in the aftermath of this crisis, provided unlimited support to financial institutions that had greatly contributed to the crisis, and this had a number of effects. First of all, there was kind of an ideological struggle over the meaning of the crisis and the response to the crisis, there was actually a trope that was used by even many progressives and liberals, that all these bailouts were what was called socialism for the rich. And I've discussed this in an article I wrote in the December 2010 issue of Capitalism, Nature, Socialism. And what I argued there is that whatever this may have been a well-intentioned kind of description, but it has the paradoxical sort of function of basically kind of holding socialism responsible for the failures of capitalism. And this was also based on an assumption, an implicit identification of capitalism with markets and socialism with the government. And what this basically obscures is that government interventions in favor of capital are not socialism. They're completely consistent with capitalism, and they reflect the fact that part of the structural power of capital is the influence it has on the political system. So after capitalism had failed in a spectacular fashion, there was already an ideological struggle over how we would define the crisis, and of course this would have an effect on the responses. And I think this kind of struggle, this attempt to kind of make socialism responsible for the failures of capitalism, was of course consistent with the rise of the Tea Party movement in the U.S. So there has also. So my point is that we have to be aware of that we shouldn't that we have to sort of foreground the undemocratic nature of capitalism and how this informs even the role that the government plays in the economy. So there has been another sort of discussion that came after the financial crisis, was the need for financial deregulation. Then again, here you can think that there was a time that there were financial regulations in the United States, much stricter than they are now, but they were eventually removed. And why were they removed? Because any gains you make within capitalism are always precarious, and when the balance of forces changes because of the structural power of capital, these gains can be repealed, and you return to square one. Now, another effect of the government support of the financial sector, of course, was the displacement of the crisis into the public sector. So one manifestation of that was the eruption of sovereign debt crisis, notably in Europe. And you had, of course, the kind of grotesque paradox of the financial institutions that had been bailed out by governments. Now they were pointing the finger at government, saying you're so irresponsible and you have to mend your ways. And this sovereign debt crisis now led to new bailouts of banking institutions that were not presented in that fashion, but were basically sort of branded as rescue packages for countries such as Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and so on and so forth. And so these packages have, given banks the time to unload their bonds on the European Central Bank, while they continue to get very cheap loans, cheap credit from the European Central Bank that is denied to countries in distress. So you have a situation where governments are doing their utmost to protect the banks that contributed greatly to the crisis that we are faced with, while they are basically imposing the cost of the crisis on ordinary workers and citizens, destroying their living standards, taking away hard-won and even basic labor rights. And so basically what this crisis is doing in many ways is to sort of highlight the ways that capitalism is fundamentally inconsistent, even with political democracy. And an extreme example, of course, is the rise of unelected governments headed by bankers in countries like Greece and Italy. And I think it is this sense of the alienation from the political system that has informed the Occupy movement. And the Occupy movement has sometimes been accused for not having demands, but I think one of the problems with this criticism is that it ignores one of the main sort of demands, which I think is implicit in the movement, which is that people should have should take away the decisions that affect their future from the hands of a small capitalist elites. So the way I sort of interpret this demand is that it's consistent with what I call the principle of economic democracy, which is basically that all people should have an equal say over the way the economy is run. So this project of economic democracy points beyond the pursuit of economic regulation. And I don't have time, obviously, to talk about what a strategy moving towards economic democracy might entail, but this is something I talk about in my book, Remaking Scarcity, that was, mentioned with my bio. So
Which will be discussed tomorrow in the panel.
Okay, I got added to this panel because Costas and Alan and I were chatting last night, and I kind of felt that, in the conversation it became very clear the way I sort of raised a few points which I felt were really important, and then they said, well, why don't you say something tomorrow? So basically I largely confined myself to saying those two things, but let me sort of give you a bit of a background. I mean, for the last several years I've been writing a great deal particularly emphasizing the centrality of the state in capitalism, arguing against the tendency, which I take to be very widespread, that takes capitalism to be a purely economic system in which states more or less do nothing. Or if they do anything, they only do the bidding of capital. Which they do, but I think they do a lot more as well. And even when they do the bidding of capital, I think it's very important to factor into that analysis, or factor into our analysis, that role of the state. Now, within this narrative, then, financialization becomes an important element in understanding where we are at right now, because it too was, I would say, a largely state-sponsored affair. There's a lot being written about financialization, and I just want to, out of those general things, emphasize 2 or 3 things before I go on. The first thing is, therefore, connected with my emphasis on the centrality of the state, is the very, very important thing I'd like to emphasize is the worthwhileness of reform. I'm not endorsing reformism, but reforms which strengthen working class ability to resist further. Winning concessions from capitalist classes through the state is centrally what democracy is all about. The point of revolutionary socialism, Marxist socialism, communism, whatever you want to call it, would be to move beyond that, not limit oneself to that, but not to avoid that in the name of some kind of empty reformism in which revolution, or empty revolutionism in which revolution is going to come in one loud thunderclap, etc. The second thing I want to emphasize is that I think Andrew's presentation is very worthwhile, and I really look forward to engaging with him on the many details he has pointed out. One thing I think that certainly leaps up at me is the extent to which financialization that has occurred has so much to do with consumer finance and so little to do with productive finance, which it was supposed to be about. The extent to which financial institutions have become reliant on consumer borrowing to make their profits, which is a very, very different thing, and it kind of shows that the present structure of financial capital has in fact exhausted its utility to most productive uses. But at the same time, but having said that, I think there are many things about this contemporary financialization which are quite similar to phases in the past. And I think there is one sense in which financialization is doubly, all capitalism affects labor, interests of labor negatively, but financialized capital does so even more. For the simple reason that financialization tends to be deflationary. because it has one single aim in mind: stop inflation. The preoccupation with minimizing inflation is in the interest of those who hold capital. It is directly against the interests of those who hold labor, because it primarily involves suppressing levels of economic activity, suppressing levels of employment, so that the value of capital in the hands of those who hold it will be preserved. Ultimately, this is a self-defeating strategy, but of course, après moi, le déluge, people don't care, after me, they will take the hindmost, etc. So I think it's very important to remember that most growth periods are mildly inflationary. This has been what has strengthened capital in the labor in the past, and that we must remember all this rhetoric. I mean, Costas talked about the installation of 2 unelected governments in Europe and the dictates of finance capital. But what is the penchant for giving independent central banks the authority over monetary policy, but to take one of the most important policy issues away from the hands of elected governments and put them in the hands of more bankers, right? Who are central bankers? They are chosen by bankers. Anyway, that's enough. Inequality, financialization creates inequality, financialization is fed by inequality. Anyhow, but the 2 things I want to mention very simply are the following. Firstly, and these are slightly sort of, perhaps not exactly, if they are Marxiological points, I'm making them because I think they're very relevant to understanding where we are at today. Financial and productive capital have been articulated in different ways through history. Now, many people reverentially reference Hilferding to say this is important for us to understand what's going on right now. In reality, if you actually read Hilferding's finance capital, the term finance capital, as Hilferding uses it, denotes the very opposite relationship between productive capital and financial capital than the one we have existing today. It was the path not taken. It focused on developments in Germany in particular, where finance capital did not refer to the subordination of industry to finance, but it constituted the development of Marx's anticipations of the polar opposite. Marx basically said financial capital is older than industrial capital. Capital's maturation will lead, Marx felt, to the subordination of interest-bearing capital or financial capital to the conditions and requirements of modern industry. Principally, through the transformed figure of the borrower. The borrower would no longer be some kind of abject borrower, but in fact, the industrialist who has the capacity to generate surplus value out by exploiting workers and then pay interest out of that. So it would actually reverse the relationship between creditor and borrower. The subordination could be achieved, Marx said, by violence, but actually typically mature industrial capital would in fact achieve this subordination much more thoroughly and effectively through, quote, the creation of a procedure specific to itself, the credit system, which is its own creation and is a form of industrial capital which begins with manufacture and develops further with large-scale industry, unquote. Early on, Marx said it would take a polemical form directed against old-fashioned usurers, to which it would be historically opposed. It would no longer be usury, but it would be financing of productive investment. That's what you need credit for. That's the sort of thing Alan was talking about, why you need credit. Hilferding's finance capital rests on this contrast, but also this is very important now. Here's a geographical distinction which is very important to understanding where we are today. Hilferding contrasts England as the exemplar of the former type, the atavistic type of relationship, the usury type of relationship, in contrast to modern industrial finance. So England on the one hand, and what Hilferding called the protectionist countries like Germany and the United States as examples of the latter type, in which industrial credit has taken the form which Marx had anticipated. Bank capital arose, Hilferding says, from the resistance of productive capital, that is profit-earning capitalists, that is of commerce and industry, against interest-earning capitalists. Though he portrays it as a further development of finance capital as a process in which the power of banks increases, and they become founders and eventually rulers of industry, who profits they seize for themselves as finance capital, just as formerly the old usurer seized in the form of interest the produce of peasants and the ground rent of the lord of the manor. Nevertheless, the relationship never reverts to the atavistic form. It continues to rely on the expansion of productive investment. Rather, the finance capital drives the expansion of production. Early on, banks supplied only short-term credit, Hilferding says. But, and now this is a slightly long quote, this changes when banks begin to provide the industrialist with capital for production. When it does this, the bank must necessarily concern itself with the long-range prospects of the enterprise and the future state of the market. Precisely what the short-term finance of our time does not do. What had once been a momentary interest becomes an enduring one. The larger the amount of credit supplied, and above all, the larger the proportion of loan capital turned into fixed capital, the stronger and more abiding that interest will be.
You're out of time.
I'm out of time. Okay, well, I can do more in the Q&A, but let me just end with one thought. And that thought is that the contemporary, I mean, why contemporary finance, it is in one sense very useful to understand contemporary financialization as the overturning of the institutions of what used to be called financial repression in the post-Second World War period. And I think that it is not a surprise that at the moment capital controls have come back into fashion. The reason for that is very simple. Those countries that had capital control are the ones that are growing today. Those countries that did not, that lifted them beginning in the 1970s, first with the United States, then with England, they are the ones who are suffering the most from the present crisis.
Let's give everybody 2 minutes each for Q&A, but first I'd like to indicate some points where I think there's disagreement that hasn't been fully brought out yet. First is on the nature of finance capital's political interests. You mentioned that finance capital seeks constantly to reduce the rate of inflation. I would argue on the opposite, that is, the holders of cash and future cash flows were hurt by inflation, and that the owner of, say, a factory would benefit from inflation, higher prices for his product while cutting his workers' wages silently, which is the canonical description of inflationary monetary policy in Hicks and in Keynes. I think that's an area where people are in this panel are probably in disagreement. And I would like to stand up, I think, for the orthodoxy of the Chicago School and say that neoliberalism begins not with Reagan and Thatcher as a political movement, but rather as an economic reality in the Carter era. Deregulation begins under Carter. And I think the crisis of the 70s and the neoliberal response are very much, political awareness, I think, lags the economic reality a bit. I think that's an area where we can sort of bring out tensions around the question of whether or not these financial reforms, which Kostas spoke of, really are gains. They weren't, it's not clear to me how exactly these reforms that don't stop a crisis are gains for a working class against capital, unlike, say, unionization, the right to unionize, the right to strike, which enable further politicization. So each one of you should have like 2-3 minutes to just respond to these or any other points that you want to raise. Same order as before.
Okay, yeah, I certainly want to make clear that I don't think that neoliberalism, is this period of the early 80s to the present where Reagan and Thatcher and stuff came in. That's the view that I was critiquing, wherein they used neoliberalism not in the sense of just a political or ideological phenomenon, but as, to use the term from the Regulation school in France, a regime of accumulation, a new social structure, to use the American term, that allows accumulation to proceed. I just think that that's completely wrong. And that's one of the things that I was trying to address here. I really think that the underlying political issue is the notion of good capitalists versus bad capitalists. They're the good capitalists who sock away, their acorns and put them back into production, and then they're the horrible rentiers. And that's what, like Joan Robinson, and that's what John Maynard Keynes were all about, was the euthanasia of the rentier, but they wanted to keep capital in existence. So it's not a Marxological point to say that all of capital has the same class interests. What we are seeing today is people wanting to ally with the so-called good capitalists, a multi-class alliance against financialization, financialized capitalism, and so forth. I think this is a betrayal of the great mass of humanity. It's a betrayal of the working class. I've been on panels where, Prabhat Padnayak and Alfredo Sadfilio explicitly called for this kind of multi-class alliance. And I think it's selling the mass of people, down the river. So I think it's very important that we see that finance is not the root of the problem here. You can't accept what I say economically, that the core of our problems go back to the fall in the rate of profit, the fall in the rate of accumulation, slow growth, rising debt burdens because of that, and then say, well, financialization is the problem. I have great respect for, the people who've risen up, Occupy Wall Street and all of that. It doesn't mean they, have given the thought and attention and have been able to hear what's really going on.
On the deregulation starting under Carter, I couldn't agree more. I think that there's a consensus, and a very important consensus in this panel, which is not the common consensus of the left, in particular the more celebritized Marxist left, which is the problems didn't begin with Reagan and Thatcher. The problems began when what is called the Great Golden Age boom, the long post-war boom, a spectacular event, by the way, and the largest such boom in history, larger than the previous booms, exhausted itself, and that began round about 1965. That's what directly led to 1968. That's what led to the counteroffensive, which was the sort of Reaganism. Then it led to the crash of 1974, and the economy's been going downhill ever since. And what you've seen is pathological developments of various kinds since then, of which financialization is only one and is only the latest. So they're agreed. On inflation, I'm going to make two recommendations. One is to read J.K. Galbraith's Whatever Happened to Money. And he just makes a very good point. He says every revolution has expropriated the bourgeoisie through inflation. Okay? What matters is not whether prices go up, but whether the working class keeps up with the rise in prices. It's the relation of class. It's class. I'm not calling you a dummy, but there's a message for the US left. It's class, dummy, right? So don't allow them to scare you into not fighting for higher wages. Don't allow them to scare you into not supporting public intervention that will reboost industry. Don't let them scare you into not fighting for full employment because it might cause inflation. That would be my line. Of course, one doesn't go out and say, yay, bring on inflation, right? And I'll just finish on one thing on that. Keynes is a wonderful story that Philip Orestes told me about Keynes, which is he was advising the Labour Party after the war about the nationalisation of the Bank of England. And they wanted him to tell them whether he should or shouldn't. He said, look, you're going to nationalise the bank because that's what you're Labour, that's what socialists do. But what you must think about is what is the terms of reference of the bank. And I propose that the remit of the bank should be full employment, not price stability. That's the point. It's not whether you're for or against inflation. It's whether you're for or against the working class, which means support the unions. It means keep up with the cost of living. It means don't sacrifice stuff because we're not making enough profit. If they can't do it, the public should do it. Co-ops should do it. Anybody should do it, right? Keep up employment, not sacrifice. That's to me what comes first.
I have a number of questions for all the speakers, but there are other points I need to make, so I'll just stick to the points. But about this, the point you mentioned, whether financial regulation was a gain as opposed to other things like unionization and so on that might be more meaningful. Well, the way I would answer to that is that in the post-war period that Alan was just talking about, you had both, and I think they were both part of a different kind of policy regime within capitalism that was not as brutal as what has come to be called as neoliberalism. of course, one of the problems at the time was that this kind of golden age that seemed very new created a sense of complacency, created the ideology of the end of ideology, that we had finally found the final model of capitalism with a human face, and so on and so forth. And what we should learn from the reversal of this is that although we need to fight for progressive reforms in that direction, like Radhika was saying, we should also realize that any gains we make within capitalism are precarious and subject to reversal, and that's why we need to be more ambitious. And ultimately, one of the connections, I do think one of the connections between, the sort of the unionization part of the golden age and the financial regulations is that under neoliberalism, what you had is that the attack on the standards of living of working people was, I think, one of the factors that led to the sort of financial bubble, because many working people, in order to be able to keep up, increasingly went deeper and deeper into debt.
Okay, just a few quick points. I agree that inflation, or rather, let me put it this way, inflation busting is the slogan of financial capital, and it works against the interest both of productive capital insofar as it is separate from financial capital. And today in the United States, that's an open question whether it is or isn't. And of course, it works against the interest of the working class. So I agree with that. I would not say that financial repression, that is to say the rules and regulations, the regulatory regime that kept finance under control, was not in favor of the working class, for the simple reason that when these controls are lifted, capital has more options. And historically, the reason why the golden age was the historic age of vast productive expansion that the world has ever known is precisely because it prevented capital from going in the direction of financialization, and therefore made it serve the interests of the working class to a greater extent than it ever has. It was no idyll. There was still a long way to go. There is no doubt about it. But there are differences. And I would say, it's not about good capital and bad capital. It's about putting controls on capital and not putting controls on capital. And historically, putting controls on capital is a step forward, has been a step forward for workers, and I think that should not be sneezed at. And I would say, by the way, I would also remind people, mention to people here, because all of you are here on a panel on financialization, you'd be very interested to read Prabhat Patnaik's amazing book, The Value of Money. I highly recommend that. Now, I just want to say one last point. Keynes was not. Actually, Keynes and Marx have more in common, and Alan and I have written a great deal about this, and I would be happy to send people references to this. Keynes and Marx have a lot more in common than most people imagine, and Keynes did not just talk about the euthanasia of the rentier. He explicitly envisaged a moment, at a moment of time which would be reached for him within 30 years. In fact, I would say it was, in a sense, was reached in 30 years, by the 1970s. From the 1930s, and at which point he argued the socialization of investment would become necessary. I really would like people to understand Keynes was a far more radical thinker than the bastard Keynesians, as Joanne Robinson called them, who are around these days, would have us believe. The right and the left, or rather, let me put it this way, it is the right that has an interest in de-radicalizing Keynes. Let the left not make the same mistake. Thank you.
We're now opening questions for the audience. We'll start. We'll take one question. I see your hands. Raise them again. But we'll start with.
Okay, first I want to say that I quite disagree with many things that Radhika said. I believe Keynes and Marx present two completely different economic theories, and to try to mix them up is something that the left has been doing since the last 100 years, and it is good that we try to stop doing it. Second, I believe what you said about financialization being deflationary is quite wrong. The historical experience shows that periods in which credit is more prevalent in the economy, periods of boom periods of the economy in which credit is more used to finance production and also consumption, these are periods that are generally inflationary, not deflationary. So if you attend to regularities to establish laws, you cannot say that financialization is deflationary because it's wrong. Next thing I want to say.
I'll try to keep questions a little bit short. But
Okay, these are not questions, are comments. So,
well, comments also. Why
I believe Andrew is wrong when he says that the rate of profit never recovered up to the 1970s. I believe he is wrong because looking at the graph he presented, if you look at the profit rate in 2001 and then you look at the profit rate in 2006, there is a clear increase. That means the profit rate recovered from 2001 to 2006. He says that that is wrong because you have to look at the long run and go back to the 1970s. But if you go back to the 1890s, you have an even longer trend, and considering the point of start that you put, then the long run trend is increasing or decreasing. So that is a very fuzzy way to reason. And finally, I have a question now. My question is, what is really financial capital? Because Marx never mentioned that term. I think Costa did a mistake when he said that Marx talks about finance capital. Marx talked about fictitious capital. Probably that is what you wanted to say, but you said the other thing. What is exactly that? For instance, the owners of stocks and bonds are financial capitalists. Is Warren Buffett a financial capitalist? I want to hear your answers to that.
So we're going to take one. We're having the panelists respond, then we'll take more questions. It's a lot, so try and keep your responses.
Take several questions at once.
I would prefer to have ones like that. Well, I mean, that was a lot of questions. There's enough to respond to. All right. In the future, just try to limit yourself to one question or comment. All right. Who wants to respond first?
So, who do you want to go first?
It's up to you.
I could go first.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to take up 2 points that you made because I think that they are good ones. On Keynes and Marx, I would simply underline the following. Both were critics of Say's law, and I think that is what truly united them. And that is why, and oddly enough, people don't understand this, but the critique of Say's law contains within it an understanding of the role of money in the economy. It is Keynes and not only were both critics of Say's law, but Marx's distinction between CMC and MCM. And this is the basis on which Keynes created his distinction between a real exchange economy and a monetary economy. And Keynes explicitly said so. He even wrote a draft of general theory which rested on that, and then he realized actually he was living at a time when Say's law has changed its form. And so he must change the character of his critique, so he created then a new draft. So I really think, and by the way, I would also add one other thing. Prabhat, in his wonderful book, Value of Money, actually traces what he calls the propertyist tradition of understanding money, which he traces from Marx through Luxemburg, Kagarlitsky, and Keynes, and I would add to that lineage also Hobson, but I can leave that aside. The second point, financialization is inflationary. I think you raise a very important point, and which is why I also find Andrew's presentation very good, because I think that we think we understand financialization, but each episode is different. In the last 2 decades, we have lived through 2 very distinct financializations. The one in the 1990s rested on very high interest rates. The one in the 2000s was based on a low interest rate regime. The first one was pre-repeal of Glass-Steagall. The second one was post-repeal of Glass-Steagall. The two have, and I would say, one last point, In the second period, interestingly enough, and I would like to explore this further, but I will just throw out this thought, financial capital became a creature of deregulation, not its master. The Volcker paradox, we have now a more competitive financial sector, but there are all these profits. I think the Volcker paradox, that is why is financial finance so profitable when there is so much competition. This paradox still remains to be answered. I have not seen a good answer to this paradox. I have suspicions, but not yet a full answer.
Okay, yeah, the question you asked, obviously the purpose of my talk was not to compare Hilferding and Marx, or to analyze either of them, but the distinction between financial and finance capital, what I wanted to underline is that there's an aspect of capital, the interest-bearing capital, money to make more money, which is not unique to the modern phase of capitalism, and that's something that Marx himself criticized. And that what Hilferding wanted to do with the term finance capital is to signal the arrival of a new sort of stage of capitalism, a new institutional structure of capitalism. So the point was to distinguish between these two things.
I think there's a profound difference between the Marxian conception of socialism and other conceptions of socialism, and that has something to do with Keynes's notion of the socialization of investment. In the preface to the German edition of his book, he said that it should be easier to implement his proposals in a fascist country than in democracy. So that's, National Socialism is a form of socialism. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes said this. I think it was 38 that book came out. You know who was in charge of that country then. Okay. I try to be brief. I have a short time to talk. I leave out the word sustain. The rate of profit never underwent a sustained recovery. Excuse me. I add that now. Okay. Look at the thick line, the bottom points. They're all prior to, this is 2009, prior to the crisis, every bottom point is lower than the one before for a period of several decades. I say that that's the non-recovery of the rate of profit.
I see. Oh, sorry. All right,
Sorry about this, but one point has to be made if we're talking about Marxist theory, because, as you know, Andrew and I have worked for some time on establishing what Marx actually says. And yes, there are differences between Marx and Keynes. I wonder if they are as great as the difference between Marx and most of the Marxists. If you read most of what passes for Marxism in the US of A and in the UK, you read Anwar Shaikh, you read Duncan Foley, you read Simon Moan, you read what the RRP publishes. Most of it is from people who have explicitly stated that Marx cannot possibly be right, and you have to found a different theory on the new basis. I say these people are promoting their own theory and not Marx's, and they should come clean. Now, on policy, that's where the real interesting inroads, that's where the real question becomes. I think anybody who's interested in what would be a good policy for the future, read, I seriously say, I don't know if I'll be allowed back into the country again, read the Communist Manifesto. Read the 10 demands at the back. Nationalization of the banks, right? Socialization of health and education, and you know what? Despotic inroads into private property. Yes. What that means is the fact that you own a factory does not give you the right to do the hell what you like with it. You cannot pollute, you cannot sack people, you cannot pay starvation wages, you cannot interfere with your neighbors, you cannot build weapons in it. You cannot be racially discriminatory. Society has the right to control what you do. If you control it and add to that you must make the economy function, you have somebody where you basically don't have private property. I'm for the socialization of property, and Keynes was for the socialization of investment. There is a hair's breadth between doing that properly and despotic inroads into private property.
I'll take 3 questions at a time now.
Yes, I agree. My name is Benn I agree that nationalisation of banks is absolutely critical because one of the big factors we left out, which I'd like you to comment on, and that is the nature of the monetary system itself. Because the big shift, which I think you were pointing to in the 1970s, was the massive shift in money supply from a public role in money supply to a more completely privatised money supply through the banking system as debt. Totally unsustainable. Managed to create a financial asset for quite some time, but in the end it ran out of steam. And what has had to come in? Yes, the sovereign debt crisis, because the state's been forced to borrow for ideological reasons. It doesn't have to borrow. And we know through quantitative easing, which is a nice name they use for state money creation. So we've got a whole missing analysis here. I mean, I do have a book on it, The Future of Money, which I've got a flyer here, but there's a whole sector that is completely missing in your analysis, I'm afraid. And it really is needed.
You had a question earlier. I'm taking it in the order I saw.
Oh yeah, I really appreciate the panel. I follow particularly Alan and Andrew's stuff as somebody who writes on economics from time to time, but don't always agree and may not have agreement here. I certainly appreciate the argument about the multi-class alliance. I think that's quite prevalent. It's in Domenico Levy's new book, I think, which is a very interesting book in many ways, but is implicit in that. So I think that's a critical thing for us to get out into the wider movement as people coming around interested in Marxism. But my question really is, I appreciate Andrew putting the chart back up, because while I obviously it's not a sustained recovery profit, I think nevertheless it is. And I want to come back to this whole question of neoliberalism. I agree that the roots go back to the 60s, no question about it. But there has been, as a result of a restructuring of capitalism, both domestically in terms of the traditional core of the system and a new centers of accumulation, particularly in East Asia and China, that I do think pose a challenge for us. We do have to say that the system has expanded. There hasn't just been a secular decline in the rate of profit straight through from the 70s and so forth. I think it's understanding, because it's, first of all, it's about social power, about the growth of the proletariat. So I just would like to get some response on that.
Yeah, I just need 2 minutes to make 2 points. It's about language and words and having discussions, intelligent discussions, and using words. 2 words I want to talk about very briefly. The first word is capital. You all talk about capitalist, good capitalist, bad capitalist, capital. If you don't know what capital is, or if you don't agree on what you mean when you use the word, then all these discussions are meaningless. The classical economists had a very clear definition of capital. It was wealth used to produce more wealth. It was factories, machines, tools, etc. Neoclassical economics came in, totally screwed the word up. Capital became anything and everything. Human capital, finance capital. You talk about capital, it becomes meaningless unless you know what you're talking about. The second word I want to talk about is profit. Profit is not an economic term. Profit is an accounting term. All profit means is expenses, gross income minus expenses is your profit. It's an accounting term, and the more you decrease expenses, the more you increase profit. If one of your expenses is wages and you decrease wages, you increase profit. Think about profits in terms of economics is to be using the wrong tool for thinking.
Okay. One more, and then I'll get you all later.
I unfortunately am not an academic, so it's been about 40 years since I read Capital. And I do believe that Marx did not talk about the decline of the rate of profit. He talked about the tendency of the rate of profit to decline, which means it's a dynamic factor. And it can be and is always attempted to be offset by the owners of capital. Currently, what they're trying to do is reduce the cost of labor power. They need the government to do that, just as the labor movement in the 40s and 50s needed the government to increase the cost of labor power through public funding for education, through minimum wage, etc. I think that we cannot get away from the dynamism of this concept. Secondly, you asked a question about the United States and the lack of, you didn't use this word, but the lack of class consciousness and the lack of an understanding of who the enemy is, which is how I would say it. You cannot underestimate the impact of the Red Scare in this country. World War II was highlighted by the unity between the United States and the Soviet Union against Hitler in this country. As soon as World War II was ending, the capitalists in this country knew they had to get rid of that concept. So they drove the left out of the labor movement. They tagged anybody who was even slightly liberal as a communist. They demonized Marxism in academia, which I'm glad to see is no longer quite the case it was when I was in college. They changed the conditions under which consciousness was shaped in this country, and the lack of an offsetting left-based movement to challenge that role of the government has ended us up where we are. We can't get away from it.
Everybody can respond whatever order they want. I'd just like to, I'd sort of like to avoid this going into like technical discussion of monetary policy, if at all possible. Sorry.
I'm going to begin with a technical discussion of monetary policy. I agree with a lot of what you said about the money system. First of all, the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the international sort of gold standard, is a really important phenomenon. We don't talk about it much in this country. Elsewhere in the world, they know about it. A lot of problems we've seen for the last 4 decades are due to the collapse of the U.S. as the dominant power of the world, and the notion that the dollar is as good as gold. A very big role has been played in these bubbles that have pumped up the rate of profit temporarily and pumped up the economy temporarily by the Federal Reserve. And the left doesn't like to criticize this because the left likes an overheated economy. Okay? But if you want to understand the financial crisis, you have to understand the overheating of the economy because they were afraid of the U.S. Economy tanking after the dot-com bubble burst and 9/11 and all of that. I absolutely agree that the exact definition of capital one uses is extremely important. I would have liked to engage with Alan about that, but I mean, to my view, capital is self-expanding value, not private property ownership over means of production. That's a very big difference. I don't understand the difference between profit as an economic concept and an accounting concept, however. You lost me on that. Yeah, Marx spoke about a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. I'm not talking about Marx there. I'm talking about the facts. This is the reality. Yeah, the capitalists have tried to do things to pump up the system, to make, to recover. It hasn't worked. And they can squeeze the workers a little bit more. I don't think it's going to work. I think the problem is that the massive capital invested is too big in relationship to any kind of profit they're going to get, and we're in for real sluggishness until we get a massive, collapse, so to speak. That's what I think is likely to happen.
I'll just like to quote Marx on the definition of capital in the University first, or somewhere it's in one of the early texts. He refers to capital as no production without storage, without prior labor, even if it is only your hand learning how to sow seeds. Human capital is not a new concept to neoclassical economics. It exists in Marx.
Just one point from before that I forgot. Financialization. Somebody mentioned that. I myself am not happy with that word. Okay? I think it's another Asian. One of the things that academia tends to do when it wants to stop talking about what's really going on is invent globalization or whatever. I worry. So let's do what Andrew. Let's say what has happened. What is different now? It's the massive increase in the marketization of financial securities, of debts. Now when you take a mortgage out, it is something that is bought and sold, the world owed us, sliced and diced and made them. That's the change. I don't care what name you give to it, but that's what's produced the change, and that's what's produced, in my mind, many of the nefarious consequences. There are other things that have produced nefarious consequences. Mary's point, I'm very glad you brought that up, and I'm sorry there has not been time to deal with it. So I do think the monetary sector and the whole issue of money is extremely important.
Marxian analysis of it.
And the
The chair said, I don't want to talk about money. That is the Marxist attitude.
And if you want to hear about it, you can come to the 11 o'clock session tomorrow morning when Anitra Nelson and Costas, and Anitra will be talking about
10 or 12, Alan.
10 till 12.
10 till I beg your
I'm
pardon.
speaking at
So
that one.
just on the rate of profit, just to say, on the rate of profit, this is a taste of what I want to start introducing into the discussion. One of the big things about the rate of profit is the denominator in the rate of profit. That is those capitals which are competing through the equalization of the rate of profit for a share of the total profit that's produced. One of the things which has so far been missed out of that equation is financial assets. Now, I've been worried about this and thinking about this for some while. I went back and read Marx, and I believe there is a clear case that when sources of interest, sources of revenue become capitalized and made into things that can be purchased and sold, they too enter into a contest for a share of the rate of profit. And I did a very simple calculation, because there's all sorts of doubts about what's happened to the US profit. The UK rate of profit is crazy. It goes down till 1974, and then it goes up. That cannot be. Why? Because out of the denominator of the rate of profit is being taken all the money that is going into financial assets instead of into productive assets. You put the financial assets back in, and in the US and the UK, and I'll be giving some of the figures which are very tentative, you get an unambiguous downward smooth trend from about 1956 onward, which I believe is actually an astonishing empirical confirmation of Marx's tendency for the rate of profit. I'm still thinking about it. I'm not sure if my reasoning is correct, but I'm just saying empirically, if you do that calculation, you put securities in there, a lot of the received wisdom about the rate of profit recovering in 1980 and in 2006 is going to take a hell of a pasting, because it didn't happen.
I guess I would also want people to contribute questions.
Just 2 or 3 points. I just take the opportunity provided by Andrew's reference to the problems of the current world economy being due to the collapse of Bretton Woods to plug my forthcoming book, Geopolitical Economy. The subtitle is After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. One of its several arguments is that the US never was hegemonic. There was no stable Bretton Woods order. It collapsed because it had to. The moment other major currencies became convertible in 1958, a couple of years later, a gold pool already had to be created to sustain the dollar. That was effectively life support for the dollar's gold roll. And then it came to an end a decade later. Second, post-2000 Fed policy. It's not because the left likes an overheated economy. Post-2000 Fed policy of easy money, going back to your first question, was prompted by the fact that Greenspan and others realized that the only thing that's keeping any growth going in the United States was the relative resilience of consumption growth after the post-dot-com bubble recession. Coming out of that recession, that was the only element of growth that was going. They kept making pious statements about we hope productive investment will recover, but quite frankly, they were not waiting for it to happen. They were fueling the consumption, credit-fueled consumption boom by keeping interest rates low, house prices rising, mortgage originations rising, etc. And finally, one little point, human capital, I'm sorry to say, does not exist in Marx. There is no such concept as human capital, and I think it's very important it is a neoclassical conception, particularly of recent vintage, to encourage human beings to think that somehow, by embodying human, it's basically to encourage competition between workers.
I'll take three round questions.
Yeah, so this question is for all the panelists except for Professor Kliman, who I think it doesn't really apply to. So my question is, the panelists called finance, capital, and occupy Marxist perspectives, but it seems to me that if what we're calling for is greater regulation of the financial sector, there's no reason why a person would have to be a Marxist in order to support greater regulation of the financial sector. And it strikes me that if one's reason for being a Marxist is because Marx agreed with Keynes, There seems to be a pretty clear
No, Marx did
So
come
my
first.
question
The
is,
bigger Keynes would discuss.
especially if you think regulation would be of great benefit to humanity, it seems like programmatically you'd be in a better position to advance that program if you stopped calling yourself a Marxist. I mean, Marxism isn't that popular. So the question is, why continue to call yourself Marxist?
Yeah, I think if you're trying to relate the state of the economy to the Occupy movement, you have to talk about the Occupy movement, at least in New York, well, no, everywhere. Enormous emphasis on redistribution of wealth. And there's this constant idea floating around that the poor are poor because the rich are rich, which then leads to saying we just need to change who's got the money, and we can fund education and all sorts of good things if we just take away some of these excessive salaries of the rich. And this is patently untrue, both because there wasn't enough money from that, there's very little money from that, but more importantly because the problem with the economy comes, I think, as Andrew Kliman said, from the mode of production and what's happening in production and not from distribution. And I think it's important to address this. This is a different issue from, like Alan was talking about, the commodification of housing, health, et cetera, education, et cetera, et cetera. That is a product of the capitalists, and that is letting them make more money off that stuff at the expense of people. But that's a different issue from this distribution issue, which I think is a noose around the neck of the Occupy movement, because they keep emphasizing that. It's blocking them from seeing that there is a huge systemic problem that they can't fix by moving money around. And we've got to talk about that, or else we mislead these young people.
I'd like to take a kind of unorthodox approach and take a psychological perspective for a moment. I think if you look at Occupy Wall Street, what you are seeing is, I'm not a psychoanalyst, but it looks to me like a suppressed desire to literally, like if you have, it's sort of like if you're a 12-year-old and you're giving a Valentine to someone, it's like, I want to be your Valentine. Well, really, you want to do something far more dramatic than that, but you're afraid of the fact that you want to do that because you're only 12 years old or 11 years old or whatever. Working class right now is still just getting its consciousness up. So we're saying, Occupy Wall Street. We're going to sit next to Wall Street and have this whole alternative thing go on. But what it really is it's a desire to take Wall Street out of the hands of the capitalists. It is to nationalize the banks. That is a repressed desire to do that. And people are afraid of doing that because they don't feel the confidence that they can do that yet. But they're obviously talking about it. So I think we should be saying that. I don't see any reason to be talking about regulating them. They clearly can't run the thing no matter what regulations they throw in there. It's failing. And one of the interesting things, I'm 29, I came around, globalization movement was happening, the 9/11 happened. All the people I met in the anti-globalization movement disappeared when the wars started. And I saw them all again when the Occupy thing happened. I said, what happened? It's like, well, the war thing happened, and that just threw everything off. And I think one of the fundamental things that happened there that was a lot of us didn't get clear is that so much of the anti-globalization movement was about asking for reforms in regulations. We're against this free trade agreement. We don't want you to have this arrangement of trade. As opposed to looking at the fundamental ability for countries like the United States to enforce its economic policy through force, like war. So instead of saying countries like Nicaragua and the Congo are not going to be free until they overthrow their own capitalist system and kick out the imperialists, we were saying, well, maybe if we just had a fairer trade relationship with this country, it would do better. I think we have the same problem we're facing right now with financialization. If we're talking about regulations, we are only going to disorient people. We've got to talk about the question of who runs the society and taking it out of the hands of the capitalists into the hands of the workers, not exactly managing capitalists better.
One more time. I'd like to get somebody new.
I just want to ask.
You were on front row.
Oh, I really don't want to ask a question, but just rather to say that given that this is a panel that was on a fairly abstract topic, I thought it was very refreshing that I'm walking away with a lot of insights that relate to my life as an activist. And sad to say, that generally is not the case. And you can tell from my gray hair, I've been going conferences like this for a long time. So I guess I would just congratulate the sponsor, the organizer of the panel, the moderator of the panel, because this really encouraged me. I'm not walking out bummed out, which I appreciate.
That's a question.
That's a good question.
More like that. The question is, talk about Warren Buffett. Is he a financial capitalist?
Right.
Thanks. My name is Fred. I'm a supporter of the internationalist group. And, when capitalism is in crisis... No, it's a comment.
Speak up, please, and keep it to a minute.
Yeah, okay. When capitalism and imperialism is in crisis, the way it gets out of it is war. And, that's the situation that's facing us ultimately today. Like Rosa Luxemburg said, socialism or barbarism. And I'm here to denounce Platypus, the organizer of this forum, for being propagandists for imperialism. Excuse me, don't interrupt me. You've had plenty of time to talk. No,
I'm sorry, do you have a question related to this panel?
Yeah, this is related to this panel. This is about how Platypus supports the U.S. occupation of Iraq, how Platypus says that the Black Panthers set themselves up to be killed, how Platypus says that the working class is dead. You're on the wrong side. You're propagandists for imperialism. Karl Marx supported the Sepoy revolt in India. Lenin supported the Boxer Rebellion in China. And when you side with imperialism, when you believe in the civilizing mission of imperialism, whether it's U.S. imperialism, whether it's the Zionist state of Israel, then you're on the wrong side of the class line. You're a class enemy.
I would like to point out that Platypus, as an organization, does not take positions. There were any accusations that we take a position in favor of imperialism, or propagandize in favor of imperialism, is absolutely wrong. In the same article,
Okay, can
we not get into this seriously?
I do not want to take more time away from the panelists than you already have.
Chomsky supports you on it?
This is out of the question.
This is out of the question. I would like to not take away time from the panelists. Please be quiet and let us proceed.
Well, sorry, not
I think these are all interesting questions. But I think we also are still missing something earlier, which is the role of East Asia and the role of the capitalist accumulation in China in providing these huge flow of funds that enabled the U.S. to borrow for so many years. Quite a bit of the current account deficit was held by China. I would like people to comment on that as well as it ties into the question. Sure.
I think that's a very important point, which I did mean to bring up earlier, but I kind of ran out of time when I was giving my talk. So thanks for the opportunity to bring it up. The global savings glut argument actually issued from the Federal Reserve. The understanding that somehow excessive savings in China and East Asia and so on is responsible for the US current account deficit emerged from Ben Bernanke's mind. There are lots of problems with this argument, which I won't even begin to go into. It's actually part of a pattern. When the Europeans were financing American deficits, a number of prominent policymakers and so on in the United States said, well, Europe actually doesn't have anywhere to invest its capital, so it's investing it in American debt. This is like adding insult to injury, or having to hold these valueless dollars, but we won't even go there. Very simply, there's a wonderful little paper which I've come across, which I think is very, and so there are all those arguments, but I'll make one other point, which is that the global savings glut argument, even if it were true, looks only at the net flows of capital. If you look at gross flows of capital, which are many times larger than the net flows, what you see is a vast amount of idle European capital was invested in American housing boom securities. That is why Europe is suffering right now, and China or India or elsewhere, they are not suffering as much. Japan is suffering because of a tsunami, not because it overinvested in the American housing bubble. So I think that is very, very important to, and I would, again, if anybody is curious about systematic sources that criticize the global savings glut argument and interested in the paper I'm quoting, which is a Bank of International Settlements working paper. It's available free on the web. I can certainly send you the link. But this is very, very important for us to refute. East Asia is not responsible for the US current account deficit, US wars, and the US historic tendency to neglect its manufacturing except where it concerns defense is at fault.
I'm sorry, you're not on the, what's your name again?
Radhika Desai. Desai is the last name. I have a bio because I'm appearing on other bios.
Okay, thank you.
Just on names, am I a Marxist? Well, Marx actually said I am not a Marxist. Okay. Je suis pas Marxiste. Why? Because the other thing that people do is rather putting Asian on the end of things, they put is on the end of things, right? What I'm for is for understanding what Marx said. I'm also for understanding what Keynes said. As regards how to deal with private property and the investor, they said the same thing. That's a fact. It's not a claim of who I want to be or who I want to be aligned with or anything like that. One of the important things about intellectual debate is to just look at what people really said. Truth matters. So that's my first point. Then on the name thing, is Buffett a financial capitalist? One should ask him. I mean, I don't. What he does is he buys and sells securities. And that is something that is now possible on a scale much greater than it was 20 years ago. It should be stopped. It's very simple. Call it regulation. Call it whatever you want. In relation to your point, if what the sort of adolescent desire is to be a banker, then I don't agree with that.
No,
I think you're saying the same thing as me, which is what these people do, and I think they've expressed it in an inchoate way, but I'm a great admirer of the Occupy movement. I began saying this is a breakthrough in American history, and the left history, since McCarthyism, that people have come out and said it's the wealthy dummy, it's property dummy, that it's class dummy. Those messages are coming out of that. That's as far as it will go. But if they want to stop it, then you're going to have to make despotic inroads into it. You're going to have to say, sorry, you can't do that. And I somehow, I think it's this legacy in the US left of objecting to regulation is part of this, thinking that the government is the enemy. If you had a law that said the landlord is not entitled to throw you out of the house because they happen to own it, are you in favour of that law or are you against that law? If you think that it's good there's a law that you cannot be sacked arbitrarily without being able to at least take your case in front of a tribunal and a court that judges whether that was a fair dismissal, are you in favour of that law or against it? If there's a law that says you should not discriminate against people because of their ability or their gender or their ethnicity or their appearance, are you in favour of that or not? I say I'm in favour of it. I'm in favour of many more laws. I'm in favour of not polluting. I'm in favour of not making people unemployed. I'm in favour of not making wars. You have to have a law. Then the question is who imposes that law. That's the issue of revolution. That's the issue of state. I happen to believe I am a revolutionary, and what that tells me is that it's only going to be possible to impose that by the will of the masses through a revolutionary movement that creates a different kind of state, a democratic state, an economic democracy. And that's also my answer. Am I just in favour of, this regulation, that regulation? No, I'm in favour of total regulation. I'm in favour of the working class regulating everything. That's what I would say. So I think, let's not confuse the issue of agency with the issue of regulation. And that's a confusion that I think they're going to have to start to get over in North America.
Oh, we're in 5 minutes. I hope
that's a good response.
Okay, I can't address everything I want to address, but I do deal in this book, chapter 9, the final chapter, with the issues of regulation, redistribution, and nationalization. Let me say that the penultimate famous chapter of Marx's Capital This is the negation of negation. The expropriators are expropriated. Okay? This is a return to individual property of the direct producers. I don't think that that was John Maynard Keynes' position when he talked about the socialization of investment. Okay. Now, I think the great thing about Occupy movement is that it has transcended the leadership of New York, and that it is so diverse, and that people are making it into what they want it to be, and they're finding ways and they're discovering, and I have great hopes because it has transcended the people in New York. On the issue of redistribution, I think you're absolutely right. What kills me about these redistribution discussions is the nationalism and the first worldism of these discussions. If we just redistributed all income in the world, we would all be absolutely equal. We would all be living at 1/4 of the average standard of living of people in this country. Okay? That is not a solution to the world's problems. End of story. Okay. As for nationalization of banks, let me just be very quick. A state-run bank is still a bank. It still has to obtain funds before it can lend them out. And to do so, it must provide a decent return to those who supply it with funds. This is true also of a worker-run bank. This means that its investment decisions cannot be based on what would enhance workers' well-being or public policy objectives, because if it tried to pursue those objectives, it wouldn't be generating enough profit, it would collapse. So a bank, even a nationalized bank or a worker-run bank, has to pursue the goal of profit maximization. The solution does not lie with redistribution. The solution does not lie with changing titles to property. The solution lies with people taking destiny into their own hands and having a new way of living and working that is not governed by the law of value that governs capitalism.
Before we leave, I'd just like to say this panel has been hosted by the Platypus Affiliate Society.
Okay, the question about whether I'm a Marxist, you can read my book and you'll find the answer. Shortly, I would say that the control of the surplus by the capitalist class contributes some of the major catastrophes and problems in today's society. But at the same time, I do want to say that the concept of the project of economic democracy, in my view, is a broader project that has the potential of uniting different streams of the left, not just Marxists, but also feminists, anti-racists, anarchists, even social democrats.
First, a round of applause for our panelists. Technically, this panel has been brought about through the work of the Platypus Affiliate Society. We have several other panels which are listed as Platypus Affiliate Society as a sponsor. We encourage you to go to that.
What is Platypus?
Platypus is a